What if the ultimate secret to escaping your deepest, darkest periods of burnout isn't actually found in some modern psychology textbook, but is hidden inside a 2,000-year-old theological document?
I mean, it sounds a little crazy when you first hear it, but
Yeah. Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are attempting this really fascinating, almost jarring synthesis of two totally different types of source material for you.
yeah, it's a wild combination.
It really is. We are taking a strictly secular behavioral framework, a corporate management and psychological document called the Four Quadrants of Coaching, and we are mashing it up with one of the most heavily debated theological texts in history.
This is a detailed breakdown of Romans chapter 7 and Romans chapter 8.
Exactly. And our mission for you today is to map this journey. We're going to trace the path from the absolute misery and gridlock that's described in Romans 7 all the way to the staggering freedom of Romans 8.
And we're mapping that progression directly onto the behavioral landscape of those four quadrants.
Yes, specifically exploring the sharp contrast between the depleted, empty shadow zone of Quadrant 3 and the spirit-led, perfectly supported growth edge of Quadrant 1.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to make sense of this journey, we need to understand the map.
Right, the map is crucial here.
So can you give us a quick visual of this four-quadrant behavioral grid?
Yeah, sure. So picture a simple graph with an X and Y axis. The horizontal axis represents direction, so like how many rules, standards, and clear expectations are being provided.
Got it.
And then the vertical axis represents support, which is how much empathy, grace, and relational warmth is being offered. So this creates four distinct zones of human interaction.
Okay, so if you have high direction but low support, that would be quadrant 4, right?
Precisely, quadrant 4. Think of like a dictator or a really rigid micromanager. It's all rules and absolutely no relationship.
Ugh, the worst. And I guess the opposite of that would be quadrant 2. So that's high support but low direction. Yeah, that's the enabler. Or, the cheerleader who gives you endless hugs, but never actually pushes you to meet a standard or grow.
Right, which leaves us with the two crucial zones for our discussion today.
Exactly. So quadrant 1 is the gold standard. It features high direction paired with high support.
So it's deeply warm, but incredibly demanding.
Yes. The source material calls this the coaching quadrant or the growth edge. But if you strip away both of those, so low direction and low support, you plummet into quadrant 3.
And this is labeled delegating in corporate speak, but the actual operational reality of it is called the shadow zone.
The shadow zone.
That just sounds incredibly bleak. I mean, it really does. And this brings us to the baseline problem that both of our sources are diagnosing today.
Right.
Because in the secular framework, quadrant 3 is where people end up when they have simply burned out. Like they have given too much for too long, or maybe they've been hurt so badly by the rigid rules of quadrant 4 that they just retreat entirely.
Yeah, you become functionally absent from your own life at that point. You start treating other people transactionally just as instruments, basically.
Because you have absolutely nothing left in the tank to offer them relationally.
Exactly. It is a state of profound numbness and passive destructiveness. You're physically present in the room, but emotionally and psychologically, you're unreachable. You've just built this heavy armor around yourself to survive.
Man, it makes me think of trying to drive a car with no gas and a completely broken steering wheel.
It's a perfect analogy.
Right. You have no emotional support to draw from, so that's the empty gas tank. And you have no clear direction or standard to follow, which is the broken steering wheel.
Yeah,
You are literally just sitting there stranded on the side of the road.
you're just stuck.
And this maps almost frighteningly well onto the biblical text we're looking at. Romans 7 describes this literal war taking place inside the human mind. The Apostle Paul is writing about this miserable human cycle where you find yourself doing the exact destructive things you hate doing.
Yeah, rather than the good things you desperately want to do. That inner conflict is the absolute hallmark of human exhaustion.
So is this withdrawal and profound isolation we see in Quadrant 3 essentially what the biblical text means when it talks about the flesh? Like, is the flesh just a broken human nature trying to live entirely independent from God?
What's fascinating here is how the ancient text anticipates this exact modern psychological diagnosis.
Right.
Because the source material emphasizes that the flesh, in biblical terms, does not just mean your physical skin or your body.
Right. It's not literal flesh.
No, it describes a corrupted operating system. It is the part of the human psyche that is inherently selfish, fearful, prideful, and like you said, fiercely independent. It wants to operate entirely on its own terms, relying solely on its own finite energy.
And the fundamental problem with relying on your own energy is that you run out.
You inevitably run out.
Mm.
And furthermore, the text notes this devastating paradox. You cannot fix a broken mind by using that same broken mind.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. The tool you need for the repair is the very thing that is damaged. So when you operate purely in the flesh, relying solely on your own willpower to meet the terrifying demands of life, you eventually just collapse into that deep emotional withdrawal. You end up locked inside the quadrant 3 shadow zone.
So we basically have a locked room from the inside. You can't willpower your way out of quadrant 3, and religion doesn't help either, does it?
No, religion usually just steps in as a quadrant 4 micromanager. It acts like a heavy polished mirror. It constantly shows you exactly how dirty you are, but offers you absolutely no water to wash yourself clean.
Man, so you can't use a broken mind to fix a broken mind. It demands an external intervention. Something or someone has to break down the door.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the monumental paradigm shift of Romans chapter 8. The text begins with what the source describes as this shocking, universe-altering announcement. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. God didn't just sit up in heaven and shout a list of instructions down to a dying world.
Right, because shouting instructions from a distance is the definition of quadrant 4 behavior. It's high direction with zero support. It demands perfection, but doesn't lift a finger to help you actually achieve it.
Instead, Jesus steps directly into the mess. The theological claim here is that he took on human flesh, lived the perfect life that humanity was completely incapable of living, and paid the debt of our failure in full.
And this introduces a brand new mechanism, which the text calls the law of the spirit of life. And it literally lifts you out of the gravitational pull of the law of sin and death.
So in our secular behavioral map, this is the radical move into quadrant 1.
Yes, moving from the isolation of quadrant 3 into the growth edge of quadrant 1.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, because I am struggling to see how these two things actually fit together without canceling each other out.
How do you mean?
Well, if religion usually tells us to just try harder, which sounds like the rigid, quadrant 4 rules well. Romans 8 is offering something completely different. It says no condemnation. But quadrant 1 requires holding people to strict, uncompromising standards. It's high direction. Doesn't removing the threat of condemnation completely destroy the high direction standard?
I see what you're saying.
Right, because if I am completely burned out in the quadrant 3 shadow zone, the last thing I want is someone demanding growth. I want to be left alone, or maybe given a nap and a hug, which sounds like quadrant 2 coddling. Doesn't quadrant 1 just sound exhausting to someone in that depleted state? Is God essentially acting as the ultimate quadrant 1 coach here, demanding growth but providing infinite support?
Yes. And what's fascinating here is the WHY behind it. To understand how God operates as the ultimate quadrant 1 guide, we have to look at why human quadrant 1 leadership is incredibly rare. The behavioral document warns us that balancing deep, genuine empathy with an absolute refusal to lower your standards requires an immense level of emotional skill. Human beings usually default to either punishing people or coddling them.
Right, the micromanager or the cheerleader.
Exactly. But God refuses to do either.
So how does he maintain the standard without crushing the burned out person?
By completely changing the location of the power source. He justifies the believer entirely, which means he wipes the slate completely clean and declares them righteous. That is maximum support. It removes the paralyzing fear of failure.
Wow, okay.
But he doesn't just leave them in a state of stagnant comfort. The text states, he sends the Holy Spirit to literally reside inside the person. This is maximum direction, but it is an internal transformation, not some external compliance program. The standard hasn't been lowered. The capacity to meet the standard has been supernaturally installed.
That is a staggering concept. He isn't just handing you a new map. He's literally replacing the engine of the car. Let's break down the specific mechanics of exactly how this high support and high direction play out in your life, according to these sources. Because the details they pull from the ancient world are just fascinating. Let's start with the high support side of the grid.
Sure.
The text leans heavily on the concept of adoption in the ancient Roman world.
Yeah, and we tend to view adoption through a very modern, sentimental lens. But in Roman antiquity, the patria potestas, which was the absolute legal power of a father over his family, was profound.
Right.
If a wealthy, powerful Roman citizen chose to adopt someone, it was a rigorous, irrevocable legal process that fundamentally erased the person's past.
And the source notes that any debts that person owed were completely canceled. Any crimes they had committed were legally struck from the record.
Wiped clean.
And perhaps most importantly, Roman law dictated that an adopted child could never be disowned.
Right.
A biological child could actually be disowned by their father, but
Mhm.
an adopted child was chosen deliberately. The bond was legally permanent.
And that deliberate choice alters the entire psychological landscape of the person. The biblical text highlights the phrase, Abba, Father, which was the everyday, intimate Aramaic word a small child used for their dad.
Like saying Papa.
Exactly. It represents total trust and absolute security. When you were adopted into this quadrant one dynamic, you weren't anxiously performing rituals to appease some cruel master. You were running into the secure arms of a perfect parent. You belong.
And the source material points out that this high support goes even deeper into human psychology, specifically regarding trauma.
Yeah, this part is amazing.
The text acknowledges that there are moments in your life where you receive news so terrible or face a crisis so heavy that your mind simply freezes. You drop to your knees and you are too weak, too overwhelmed to even formulate a prayer. You literally don't know what to ask for.
Right.
In those moments of profound cognitive overload, the Holy Spirit provides perfect quadrant one support by interceding for you with wordless groans.
The mechanism there is beautiful. Because when language fails, because the trauma is too deep, the Spirit takes your raw, unarticulated agony and translates it into a perfect prayer that is entirely aligned with God's will. The support catches you precisely at the point where your own capacity completely disintegrates.
Man, that covers the absolute empathy of high support. But quadrant one also requires high direction. It requires a destination.
The standard must be maintained.
Right. And the theological source calls this standard the golden unbreakable chain of salvation. It lists a sequence: God foreknew you, he predestined you, he called you, he justified you, and he glorified you.
The destination was set before the universe was even formed.
And what is that destination?
Yeah.
You are predestined to be conformed to the image of Jesus. That is the ultimate high direction. You are being molded into a specific, perfect character.
Yes.
But looking at this logically, I have to ask, if we are so perfectly supported as adopted children, with our debts wiped clean and the Spirit translating our groans, why is there still so much pain in our lives? I mean, if my life is falling apart, does that mean the high support is failing and I'm sliding back into the shadow zone?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the biblical text addresses the reality of suffering head-on. Paul uses the visceral analogy of childbirth. When humanity rebelled, it didn't just fracture the human soul, it fractured the physical universe.
Physical world is in a state of decay.
Right. But Paul insists this suffering is like the agonizing pains of labor. The agony is intense, but it is absolutely not pointless. The pain indicates that a new world and a new you is being born.
It's the friction of the quadrant one growth edge. Growth hurts.
Exactly that. God is described as so entirely sovereign that he can take the absolute worst, most destructive things that happen to you and engineer them to build something magnificent.
Oh, like the story of Joseph.
Yes. The source illustrates this with the Old Testament story of Joseph. Joseph was despised by his own brothers. They violently threw him into a pit, sold him into foreign slavery, and later he was falsely accused of a crime and left to rot in a dark dungeon for years.
Objectively, every single one of those events is a tragedy. There is no silver lining to being sold into slavery.
Not at all. But the theological claim is that God utilized the pit, the slavery, and the unjust dungeon to position Joseph in the exact geopolitical location he needed to be in to eventually save millions of people, including his own family, from a catastrophic famine.
Wow.
What human malice intended for evil, God engineered for good. Therefore, the pain in your life isn't a sign that the quadrant one support is failing. Often, it is the exacting mechanism of high direction. It is God shaping your character through the fire, making you look more like Jesus.
Which brings us to the culmination of this mashup. We've mapped the agonizing shift from the isolated burnout of quadrant 3 to the spirit-led growth of quadrant 1. What is the ultimate final reality for a person living in this integrated state?
The text provides a massive perspective shift with a single question. If God is for us, who can be against us?
That single equation is basically designed to reduce all human anxiety to dust.
Absolutely.
A million enemies, a collapsing economy, a terrifying medical diagnosis, all of it standing against you is mathematically nothing compared to the creator of the universe standing beside you.
Yes.
And the text makes a brilliant distinction here about being more than a conqueror. A standard conqueror is just someone who outmuscles and defeats an enemy, but someone who is more than a conqueror takes the actual weapons the enemy used against them, the trauma, the persecution, the catastrophic failure, and repurposes those exact weapons to build their own kingdom.
The very things designed to crush your spirit become the foundational stones that elevate your character.
Yeah.
And the source goes out of its way to emphasize that this quadrant 1 bond is entirely unbreakable. It lists this breathtaking catalog of things that cannot separate you from this love.
Right, like not death.
Right, which the text frames merely as a doorway to his presence. Not life, regardless of how messy or painful it becomes. Not angels or demons, meaning no spiritual dark force has the power to pry God's fingers off of you.
Wow.
Not the crisis you are facing in the present. Not the terrifying unknowns lurking in the future. Not height, not depth. If it is a created thing, it fundamentally lacks the authority to separate you from the Creator.
So what does this all mean for us practically? To really hammer this home, the text provides a vivid courtroom analogy.
Yeah, this is so good.
Imagine you are standing on trial for your life. The enemy Satan, a title which literally translates to the accuser, is acting as the prosecuting attorney. And he is relentlessly yelling out every single mistake you've ever made.
Every horrible thought, every selfish action.
Every time you hurt someone.
He is laying out the undeniable empirical evidence of your time in the Quadrant 3 shadow zone. He's proving your guilt.
And he's right. Like, the evidence is real. But the judge, who possesses the absolute final authority in the cosmos, looks down at the bench and declares you completely innocent. He justifies you based on the adoption we talked about earlier.
Yes.
And Jesus, who is the only entity in the universe who actually possesses the moral right to condemn you because he alone is perfect, refuses to condemn you. Instead, he steps in as your defense attorney, holds up his hands, and simply shows the judge his scars. The debt is already paid. The case is dismissed.
It's just a beautiful image.
It really is. But this brings up a practical issue. In the secular framework, living in Quadrant 1 is described as exhausting. It requires so much sustained relational presence and mental focus that it eventually drains a human coach. Does this eternal courtroom verdict finally cure the burnout of Quadrant 3?
Well, this raises an important question about the fundamental limits of human capacity versus divine capacity. Human Quadrant 1 leadership causes burnout because human energy is finite. To hold high support and high direction simultaneously requires an emotional toll that a human being simply cannot sustain forever. We inevitably drift. We collapse back into apathy and rigid rules.
Right.
But God's Quadrant 1 is unrelenting because his capacity is infinite. The theological text emphasizes a critical reality here. Your salvation, your daily security, does not depend on your desperately flawed ability to hold on to God.
Because if it did, you'd burn out all over again by Tuesday.
Exactly. You would exhaust yourself trying to maintain the grip, and you'd slide right back into the shadow zone. Your security depends entirely on God's unending ability to hold on to you. You're no longer living on probation, anxiously waiting for the other shoe to drop or for the coach to get tired of your failures.
Because you are a legally adopted heir.
Yes. The exhausting, miserable cycle of trying to fix your brokenness with your own broken mind is over. The spirit of life is holding you, and he does not get tired.
Man, that is just a phenomenal synthesis. To summarize this deep dive for you listening, we have mapped a really profound journey today. We started in the miserable, depleted, autopilot state of Quadrant 3, what the biblical text calls the flesh, or that agonizing cycle of Romans 7.
It's the place where you are stranded on the side of the road with no emotional support and no moral direction.
Right. And we've charted the divine intervention that pulls you out of that locked room and into the ultimate growth edge of Quadrant 1, the spirit-led reality of Romans 8. You do not have to live trapped in the heavy, burned-out architecture of your own isolated mind. You have a perfect Father who is offering you both the ultimate standard for your life and the ultimate unbreakable safety to reach it.
It is a roadmap that acknowledges the reality of human suffering, but promises that the destination is secure.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We've talked entirely about how you receive this grace, but think about how you project it.
Oh, that's a great point.
If the creator of the entire universe is perfectly modeling this Quadrant 1 coaching for you right now, holding you in absolute unconditional love while relentlessly and carefully transforming your character through the trials of life, how might that completely alter the way you respond to the next person who fails you?
Yeah, that changes everything.
Right. When your coworker drops the ball, or your child rebels, or your friend deeply hurts you, how will you react? Are you going to extend to them the exhausting, rigid, judgmental law of the flesh? Or are you going to offer them the liberating, supportive, yet incredibly demanding law of the spirit? When you look at the map of your own relationships today, which road are you going to choose?